Welcome to Anatomy Karma for the skeletal system, the app intended to help community college students to learn anatomy. In this video, we review the hard-to-find surface markings and bones. We will start with a reference landmark that is easy to see and relate other surface markings or bones to that landmark. The posterior skull, cervical vertebra, the side view of sacrum, and ribs are not reviewed in this video because the surface markings are clearly identifiable from within the app. Our first view is the anterior view of the skull. We're going to pick the landmark, the nasal bone, this bony bridge of our own nose. And one difficult to find bone here is the lacrimal bone. This is this oval, smooth bone just to the side of the eye socket. Another landmark that we're going to pick is the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate leads us to the vomer bone, which is this, at least in the anterior view, small perpendicular standing bone inside the nasal cavity. Our last landmark on this skull view will be the orbit, the eye socket itself. On the top portion of the orbit, there's a small opening. This is the supraorbital foramen. This is a hard to find small opening on this anterior view of the skull. Our next view is the side view of the skull. For our first landmark, let's pick this mastoid process. This is a thick, thumb-sized bony projection coming from a temporal bone. Immediately to the left of this mastoid process, there's this crater-like structure, the external auditory meatus. And a little bit further to the left is the styloid process. Another landmark is the zygomatic process. This is a projection coming out yet again from a temporal bone. And this is leading us to the temporal process. You can barely see the suture here between the zygomatic and temporal bones. So at the suture, the zygomatic process ends and the temporal process begins. When you put the temporal process and the zygomatic processes together, we get the zygomatic arch, and that concludes the hard to find, challenging parts on this view of the skull. When we look at the inferior or underside view of the skull, our first landmark will be these large arching smooth bony structures, the pterygoid process. Very close to the base of the pterygoid process, a little bit to the side, is an opening, the foramen ovale. Another landmark that we will use here is the foramen magnum. To the side of the foramen magnum, there is an arching, smooth, bony surface, the occipital conda. When we look inside the skull, we're going to select our landmark, the sella turcica. This deep ridge and crested area in the middle of the sphenoid bone is our landmark. From the base of the sella turcica, there is a bony ridge. And on the side of that bony ridge is this hard to find part, the internal auditory meatus. And this is the last part here we review on the interior view of the skull. On a mandible, we're going to use coronoid process as our landmark. There are a number of difficult to see surface markings here. Immediately to the right of the coronoid process is the mandibular notch, this semicircular depression. One edge of the mandibular notch is this upward pointing condylar process. And right on top of the condylar process is the mandibular condyle. On our first vertebra, the atlas, we will use the superior articulating facet as our landmark. Superior articulating facet are oval, long, smooth depressions on the top superior aspect of the atlas. It's difficult to see from this view where the transverse foramen is. The edge of the transverse foramen is visible right next to the superior articulating facet. Our next vertebra is the axis. We are going to use here the superior articulating facet as well as our landmark. And again, the difficult to see transverse foramen is right close to the top and to the side of the superior articulating facet. On the thoracic vertebra, we're going to use the transverse process as our landmark. And on the side of the transverse process, there is this depression facet for the articulating part of the rib, which is a challenging surface marking to find. Take a look at the other side. Again, transverse process is thick, bony projection laterally. And then here's this depression, the facet for the articulating part of the rib. When we look at the side view of the thoracic vertebra, again, we have this transverse process now projecting right at us. Here is the facet for the articulating part of the rib. We also have the superior articulating facet, which is articulation with the next vertebra. So superior articulating facet rounds out the challenging parts on the side view of the thoracic vertebra. On the lumbar vertebra, we're going to use here the transverse process as our landmark. And right at the base of a transverse process, there is another bony projection. This is a difficult to locate superior articulating facet. Again, on the other side, here's the transverse process. And at the base of it is the superior articulating facet. On the side view of the lumbar vertebra, we're going to use the spinous process, which looks like the nose of a moose. This is our landmark. Difficult to see parts. The inferior articulating facet, which is like the beard of the moose. And we have this superior articulating facet, which is more like an antler to the moose. The transverse process shows up as more like the ear of that moose. On the anterior view of the sacrum, we will use this line of openings, the sacral foramina. as our landmark. When we follow these lines of sacral foramina all the way to the top, we see a sharp ridge. This is a difficult to identify part. This is the sacral promontory. On the posterior aspect of the sacrum, we will use the central strong ridge, the sacral crest, as our landmark. And if you follow the sacral crest all the way to the bottom, there is a point when there is a gap here. Sacral hiatus is a difficult to locate landmark on the posterior aspect of the sacrum. Sacral crest will lead you to that. Sternum, our landmark will be the body, the central flat large bone of the sternum. Where the body and the manubrium meets, a ridge forms, and this is the sternal angle. In this particular bone, there is a little crevice between the manubrium and body. It helps to see it. The sternal angle is the last difficult to find challenging surface marking on the axial skeleton.